Welcome back to the More Than Mothering podcast, episode number 13. I'm your host, Crystal Hardstaff from The Gentle Counsellor, where I specialise in perinatal mental health and parenting support. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Allison, who's going to share us a bit about her story and her own motherhood experience. Welcome to the More Than Mothering podcast, Allison. Thanks for chatting to us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, Allison and I have already been having a bit of a chat about a couple of things we wanted to cover, and I think this will be a really helpful episode and relatable one if you have multiple children. And Allison also has a bit more of her own unique experience she wants to share with some of her struggles in postnatal as well as insomnia. So, Allison, do you want to start by telling us a bit about yourself and your family and just to kind of introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks. So I'm Allison, I'm 39, just turned 39 last week, so almost staring down the barrel of 40. So I grew up in North Queensland on a sugarcane farm, and then just pretty typical, sort of went to uni, and I work as a clinical pharmacist in a hospital. So I've done that now for, a lot of years, like 16, 17 years, something like that. So I met my husband a couple of years ago, and we had our first child, Hannah, who just turned 2. And when did I have her? I would think I had just turned 30. Well, I got 37. Sorry. I had her when I was 37. So a little bit later in life. My husband and I didn't meet until a bit later in life. So we just started the baby making process a bit later. So I guess from that perspective, it was a little bit more of a shock to the system. And then we've just had our second child, Henry, 4 weeks ago. So I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-week-old at the moment. So I'm on maternity leave for the second time with our second child.
And many success with him having a nap at the moment.
Yeah, it all worked out, which is excellent. So fingers crossed it'll be a longer one this time. He likes to have long naps during the day and then not sleep at night.
What a fun reversal.
I know. We're still working on that. But 4 weeks, you can't really expect too much, I think.
Yeah. And it's so much more different the second time around when you have a toddler running around too, and then you're trying to get the toddler to stay quiet when the baby's having a sleep.
Oh, and she just wants to be on him, and she just wants to be near him and touch him, and then she gets really cranky if she can't.
Oh, so sweet. Big sister.
She's very sweet. Very sweet. Very not coping too well with not being the center of attention, but I'm hoping that's just sort of hopefully not a long-term thing, just a short-term thing while she
it's a big transition for everyone in the family.
I know, and I was so smug. I was like, oh, she's fine. Because the first couple of weeks, she was really good. And I was like, oh, this is great. It's excellent. Maybe I've done all this good job of reading the big sister books to her and preparing her. And then the wheels kind of fell off, and she wasn't sleeping through the night anymore. And, she was having a lot more tantrums about getting dressed, what she wanted to eat, that sort of
Oh my gosh, I remember that too. It sounds like yours are a similar age gap, because mine are 2 years and 4 months apart, and she started waking up again. And I have a picture of me in bed with him as a newborn and her as a toddler, and because I tandem fed for a little bit, and I just remember, and I can still put myself in that moment of just how unbelievably tired I was and how overwhelmed I felt. But at the same time, this weird sense of, I don't know if peace is the right word, but I just had this weird feeling of this is it and this is okay. This is just for now.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I was able to grasp some sort of wisdom to keep my sanity in that moment. And then I asked my husband to take a photo because I wanted to remember that moment. It was a combination of the most horrific time and beautiful time in this couple of minutes moment at 2 a.m. or whenever it was.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, look, it's definitely, with the second you sort of get a fair bit of experience, and you kind of really realize that all this is just temporary. It'll pass. It'll be fine. It'll be okay.
And it does go by fast, but that's not fun to hear when you're in the thick of it.
No, and you know what? The only thing, I know we'll talk to the insomnia stuff later on, but the only thing one of the few things that was good about it is when I had insomnia, I wasn't sleeping at all. So like, this is actually like, I really know how little sleep I can survive on. So there's a lot of solace in that a little bit. So when I have like 4 or 5 hours at night, I'm like, okay, I've survived on this before.
You're like, that's a full night's sleep. Yeah, great. It's funny how your standards lower.
I know.
So
exactly.
much. Yeah, I think I had the same thing too. I was like, 3 hours in a row. Oh, I feel great.
I know. I literally just had 3 hours in a row last night. I was like, wow.
Yeah, you feel brand new.
Yeah.
I think I've finally made that turning point now where now I'm at that stage of getting sleep in my life where I can actually prioritize that. And for context, like my son is 4.5. And so I feel like that's finally, it's been gradual. I'm not trying to like scare people when I say that, but it's like, I just realized I was like, oh, I don't have that stress of like, when's he going to wake up?
Yeah.
And he does still wake up and he comes into our room, but we have like a little side bed for him. And he doesn't even disturb us when he comes in. Half the time, I don't even notice he's come in. So, and he's also on my husband's side of the bed because I told him it was his turn because I did it for all those early years. So that's probably also why I'm sitting here going, my sleep's great now.
Look, it's the same. Like Hannah, I think people hold it up. You know, people are like, oh, do you have a good baby? In inverted commas, are they sleeping through as if that's like the gold standard? And it's like, no, the gold standard is actually like, if she wakes up and I can, you know, calm her back to bed, and then I can get back to sleep.
That's a victory.
That's a win. Like if I can have 6 hours of sleep a night, even if it's broken, that's a win. Like I'm not setting the bar any higher than that because it doesn't need to be any higher than that.
That's such a good attitude to have.
Like that's not the benchmark of a good, in inverted commas, child or a bad child. It's more like it's got nothing to do with it, whether they sleep through or not.
Yeah. And what always frustrates me the most about people who say that is that when you're pregnant, people make jokes and tell you to get sleep. They're like, oh, sleep while you can now. And so that doesn't make sense to then they go, oh, they're sleeping through yet? It's like, hang on a second. Last month when I was still pregnant, you were admitting that I wasn't going to get much sleep, as if you're acknowledging that babies will wake up. Yet now that I have the baby who's like a week, or in your case, like 4 weeks old, why are you suddenly changing into expecting that they're sleeping through?
I know, like it's crazy. The whole thing is upside down when it like it's the things that people talk about, and the whole industry of like sleep training and whatever. That's
a whole conversation on its own.
I know, right? Maybe I need to be that for adults with insomnia now.
Well, I was going to say, let's
self-proclaimed guru.
Well, do you want to start sharing with us a bit more about your experience and your story with that then? Because that's not really something that I've not only not seen people talk about, but I haven't talked about that. My only experience was insomnia. I think I had it a bit in pregnancy, and I went a bit nocturnal for a while. Like I swapped my sleep around. I'd be up at night and sleep during the day. That was my first time because I didn't have a toddler around then. I could actually do that. But yeah, it's not really something I see or hear people talking about. So I'm really intrigued to hear your experience with it.
I might just mention quickly about like how it started, if that's all right, because that really links into like my experience with Hannah. So basically I was, you know, rightly or wrongly, you know, on Instagram. I wanted to be on with all the wellness people. I wanted a natural birth. I wanted to breastfeed. I had this real image of like what me as a mother was going to be, you know, like I was only going to feed my baby like unprocessed, like natural food, you know, all of that sort of stuff. And and I ended up needing to have a cesarean because my baby was in breech and had 100th percentile head, and I'm just a regular sized person. And so I was like, well, turning a baby and then inducing me early to like try to deliver naturally, it was all just not going to happen. So anyway, had a cesarean, and very quickly I realized that I wasn't a very good breastfeeder. My daughter didn't have a very good latch. So from the get-go, we had a lot of difficulty with feeding. She lost sort of more than 10% of her body weight, which is, so in babies lose weight in the first 3 days of their life. It's very normal. It's just to try to like waiting for your milk to come in. But some people like myself, because I didn't have a lot of breast milk, she lost more weight and she was very, very unsettled. So we were mixed feeding and we soon got into a situation where I was breastfeeding, then giving her formula in a bottle as like a topper, and then expressing after that to try to increase my supply. So triple feeding, which takes hours, and like it was just the burden was quite high. She was also then a baby that, you know, had a lot of colic, had a lot of reflux, vomiting. She actually had cow's milk protein intolerance as well. So I cut out dairy and soy, and I think I cut out gluten from my diet as well to try to like preserve the breastfeeding. And it was all just really, really difficult. She was a really tricky baby. I was very unsure of myself as a first-time mum. And I think, you know, I read I've got a background in health. And so I was, you know, reading everything that I could possibly find about everything, you know, and when she didn't meet the weight, I was obsessed with the weights, you know, like the weekly weighs that they do. If she didn't, you know, make 150 grams, I'd be plotting where she was on the growth charts. And I was so convinced that I'd have this baby that would have like failure to thrive and need a nasogastric tube.
That would have been so scary. Yeah.
It was really scary. And a lot of it was in my head. Well, a lot of it was in my head. And, you know, I'd see one doctor and they'd say, no, she's fine. She doesn't have cow's milk protein intolerance. And then I'd see another doctor. And I just kept, you know, I think I saw 3 lactation consultants, 2 pediatricians, and 2 different GPs. So I was like spending so much money. And anyway, my anxiety was just ramping up.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where I was like, I think I was in Woolworths, and I realized that I hadn't left my house other than to go to an appointment or by myself in 3 months. So I didn't go to Woolworths or like any shop, any cafe, anything in 3 months straight. I was just so obsessed with her feeding and making sure I didn't miss a feed and trying to get her sleep schedule because, you know, like trying to control, because that way I could sort of.
Yeah. And that makes sense with the anxiety, because that's what anxiety is. It's a fear of not having control.
Yeah. And so I was really, I was quite bad with that. And then it all sort of came to a head at the 4-month mark where it just wasn't working. And so I made the decision that I was going to stop breastfeeding and we were just going to put her on formula, which was a really tough decision for me.
I imagine that would have been really hard to make that choice.
Letting go of that and basically saying, no, look, it's just not working. You need, you know, breastfeeding's not working. She's still really upset and unsettled, and you cut all these things out of your diet and you triple, you know, you're doing all this stuff, you know, she's just better on a formula. And so when I did that, swapped her to formula, she improved very quickly. So whatever was happening that wasn't agreeing with her, she, you know, the reflux stopped, the colic stopped. She started putting on consistent weight. But I don't know why. And I think maybe when you breastfeed, your body releases hormones that help you get back to sleep, I think. Anyway, so once I stopped breastfeeding altogether, because I'd worked myself up over the space of the preceding 4 months into this like really heightened state of anxiety, I discovered that I just couldn't sleep. Even though she was sleeping, I couldn't sleep at all. So I would just lie awake at night for hours and hours and hours. And it was just terrible. I was still really, really anxious, and I couldn't sleep. And that was just then fueling the anxiety as well, because I wasn't very well rested. And so, that kicked off what was then another sort of 8 to 9 months of my experience with insomnia, which was quite almost harder than the anxiety itself, because I did the same thing that I'd done when with the feeding, is that I just researched. And so I started putting in place all these behaviors that were actually detrimental, but at the time I thought that they'd be helpful. So I started trying to go to bed earlier. So I basically would, you know, be spending, other than getting up to feed my daughter, I'd be spending like 12 hours in bed, you know, because if I went to bed at 7 o'clock, maybe I could get 5 or 6 hours of sleep. I started having particular like soundtracks or like music that I needed to listen to. I had all these elaborate rituals of like, this bedtime tea that I'll drink before I go to bed, and to try to help me sleep. And, I've got to have a shower because I've got to have a really hot shower, and then, be in a really cold room, and that'll help me get to sleep.
Yeah, these are kind of some of those things that the articles that you read online
share
with you to try. Yeah.
100%. Can't have screens before bed. So I've got to stop looking at my phone for an hour before bed. And I've got to, cut out the 1 cup of coffee that I have a day, because maybe it's the caffeine. And so that all, and it's funny because a lot of the things that you read that talk about doing that actually do the opposite of what you want. See, it's a bit of a tricky thing, sleep. A lot of people that I talk to and I say, oh, tell me about your sleep. And they say nothing. I just get into bed and I turn out the lights and then I'm asleep.
Oh, how nice.
And then I wake
What's that like?
Exactly. And they say, well, I don't really think about it. And that's exactly how it should be, because sleep is an involuntary process. You can't control your sleep. You can't press a button and sleep. And so the more focus you put on it, the more rituals you have, the more you try to control your sleep, the worse it is actually becoming, because you're just putting all this attention on something, which actually, like, it's hard to describe. I'm trying to think of a way. It's trying to basically put all this attention on something that you have no control over actually makes the situation far worse than what it's. And so that's what I was doing. And
coupled with the anxiety and trying to find a sense of control, it's like that feeling and behaviors kind of shifted from the early experiences with your daughter and the feeding and her sleep, and then it's like jumped ship and then started focusing with your sleep and the insomnia struggles.
100%. And with my anxiety as well, it was a really tricky time, because I didn't want to take sleeping tablets, because I know that, it's not you don't really get proper sleep with sleeping tablets. You get sort of sedation, which is different. And the sleeping tablets don't actually mimic the same stages of sleep that your body would naturally experience. And also you can get dependence on them as well. But all things that I didn't want. So I knew, I guess, with my background, that sleeping tablets weren't the answer. But I was also so I was in a really hard place. So, I ended up seeing a GP, and I ended up going on to an antidepressant medication, I think, to try to dial back the anxiety. Because for me, one of the things that was the key to sort of coming out of that really bad period of time was getting control of my anxiety, and realizing that once I sort of dialed back that sort of fight or flight response, that me being in a constant state of being on sort of hypervigilant, sort of starting to dial that back actually ended up fixing my sleep. And also
kind of like soothing your nervous system a bit, getting a bit more regulated.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm sort of jumping around between the insomnia and the anxiety, but
it goes hand in hand. So yeah.
And so it was really, for me, making dialing back the anxiety, taking the focus off my sleep completely. So I went back to drinking coffee. I went back to checking my phone, putting it down 2 seconds before I went to bed. The only sort of structure that I had was a set bedtime and a set wake time of okay, well, I'm only going to be in bed for 8 hours. And if I sleep 3 hours, then I sleep 3 hours. Right. And being okay with not sleeping.
That makes sense, because it's that permission to be okay with it that would have, I can imagine, alleviate some of that pressure.
It does.
From feeling I have to get this amount. It's well, regardless, it's 10 o'clock bedtime and 6 a.m. wake time, or whatever it was.
And there's some research, like cognitive behavioral therapy research, that talks to that as well, about how you should just have a set, this is my bedtime, this is my wake time, and if it's 6 hours or 5 hours or 7 hours or 8 hours, whatever it is, and by doing that, you're sort of taking the focus away from your sleep. So the other thing that I started to do when I had insomnia was if I had only had 2 hours sleep, then I wouldn't catch up with friends, or I wouldn't go to the baby sensory class, or I'd start changing my day to fit around how I felt about my sleep. And I'd be oh, I feel terrible, I can't meet you for a coffee, or I can't do X, Y, Z, or I can't go for a walk with the pram because I'm too tired. And so doing those things anyway, regardless of whether I'd had 0 hours sleep or 5 hours sleep, it sort of started taking the power away from it. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So you just carry on. Basically, you just be okay with not sleeping, and you say, well, okay, if I get 2 hours, I get 2 hours. It's better than 0 hours. And then you just get on with your day, because the less airtime you give it, the better.
And you're still getting to go and do the things that you want to do and enjoy your life during the day.
You're sort of taking the power back.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting mindset shift for me, because it was completely different to what I'd read about. Sort of, when you Google how to treat insomnia type thing. So for me, that was really helpful, doing that. And then also, being on an antidepressant medication for a few months also really helped dial back the anxiety, and seeing a psychologist as well. That was very helpful for me, trialing some different things to, just help to sort of set me back to the way that I was before, like a bit of my old baseline, if you will.
Right.
And so that process took sort of, 12 months-ish or so, I think.
So when you're saying that you were kind of struggling for like 8 or 9 months with the insomnia, do you mean like 12 months from that point? You feel like then you were getting better, or do you mean like the entirety?
Yeah. So 12 months. Basically, when Hannah turned 1 was about when I was pretty much back to normal.
Yeah, wow. So kind of like the last, 3-4 months?
Yeah, the last 3 or 4 months were much better. It was, and so it was just then getting into a bit more of a, getting a bit more of a routine and getting good nights of sleep under my belt. Because one of the things that you lose when you have insomnia is confidence in your ability to sleep. That's why you think that you need the bedtime tea and the magazines.
And would you find yourself dreading bedtime?
Yeah, I found myself getting really anxious about going to sleep and whether I was going to sleep. And to add a bit of complexity to things, because it was such a hard year, the first 12 months of Hannah's life, I said to my husband, we decided that we were going to move from the capital city that we live in to 100 k's down the road, nice beachside suburb. And so I then got a brand new job at a brand new hospital that I'd never worked at. And so I was actually starting a new job at the same time as all of this. And so I forgot where I was going with that. Basically, I think it took sort of 12 months, because I was also, there was also anxiety about, the new job and not being able to sleep for the new job, that sort of thing.
So some of those other like life factors that were happening were kind of then pushing the timeline out, I guess, on when you felt you could get that support.
100%. Yeah. So getting a few more, and then once I started getting some good nights of sleep under my belt, realizing that I can, work, because one of the big fears that I had was maybe I won't be able to go back to work. How can I work if I'm only sleeping 3 hours a night? What if I can't drive a car? It's not safe for the patients, or et cetera, that I'm working with. And then realizing that you can survive on less sleep.
Yeah, and can function. Yeah.
I mean, not that it's ideal. I would be in a situation where I have 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night, and then the next night, or maybe I'd do that for 2 nights in a row, and then the third night, because I was so exhausted, your body kind of catches up with you, and then you sort of just crash out and have like a full night's sleep. And that tended to be the pattern. And so, realizing that, I can function and I can do my job and I can do all that. It sort of gave me back the power, and it
built your confidence.
Yeah, exactly. I think, because the insomnia was a lot of it was sort of fear of not sleeping. What if I'm going to be like this forever? What if I'm never going to sleep again?
Such awful thoughts to have. And that's in no way relaxing. It's interesting how it works, right? Because it just keeps feeding on itself to some degree. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And it sounds like how you were able to interrupt that by having more acceptance and self-compassion.
Yeah, just saying, okay, this is the way it is, and it's okay. And if I have 3 or 4 hours of sleep, and I keep saying that again and again throughout this conversation, but it's so true for me that you have to accept the situation as it is and stop trying to change it. There's so much in motherhood that's just about surrendering control. Like, and I think at the heart of my anxiety experience is surrendering control of the situation and just, you know, taking each day as it comes and just being as present in the moment as you can. And that took and still takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, it's hard to do. It's easy for us to sit here and say that, but then putting it into practice can be challenging. But I also have found that the more you do it, the kind of like easier it gradually gets, whether it's easier with the one situation or easier to implement that similar shift in your mindset for like a different challenge. It's kind of like building like the muscle of that.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And I think that I've just had my second child 4 weeks ago, and because of all of the issues that I had with my firstborn, I had a lot of trepidation going into even having a second child in the first place, because such a traumatic experience. You know, you've had 37 years of seeming like mostly good mental health. You know, I didn't have any issues. I didn't even appreciate that I was predisposed to anxiety until I had my first child, and then realized, oh goodness, there's all this like stuff that's been percolating in the background that
would have been such a shock to the system.
Yeah, very much. And then I think the other thing is, working in the health industry, you see a lot of people with issues, you know, like diabetes, blood pressure, heart attacks, all these sorts of things. And, you know, if you break your leg, you can't go for a run like you wanted to. You can't climb stairs like you wanted to, but you can still enjoy a nice meal. You can still chat to a friend. You can still watch a show on Netflix. When you have anxiety or mental health issues, it encompasses every aspect of your life. And so it wasn't until having anxiety that I realized just how debilitating it can be in every aspect of your life.
Yeah, it finds its way in every way.
Yeah. From watching a podcast listening to a podcast to going for a walk or catching up for like, it's everything. And so then coming out of it and realizing I just was so scared. I was like, look, I barely, you know, I'm going to joke, clawed my way back to sanity. It's very melodramatic because it wasn't that bad, but like, you know, I've just come good again. What if this happens a second time? And like, what if I'm not? What if I, you know?
So understandable to have that fear though, because you know exactly how that felt, and it's still fresh in the sense that it hasn't been that long ago, right? Which is too, but also you remember how hard that was in the day-to-day, and the examples you were giving as well is what sucks about struggling with like your mental health or anxiety is that it's invisible, as opposed to like a broken leg that's visible. So even the people around you and how you're being treated, or how you have to try so hard to explain to people what you're going through, it's also exhausting in that to try to communicate what is happening
100%
within you, because it's not obvious.
And you can't turn it off. You can't say, okay, for this 30 minutes or 2 hours or something, I'm just going to enjoy it.
You can't put a cast on it and wait 6 weeks and then it's guaranteed 100% fixed.
100%. It's very much like that. And so I really struggled with that decision because you know, I think I said that I had Hannah when I was 37. So like the clock is ticking.
Oh, you would have had that feeling, that pressure of time as well.
I desperately just wanted, like, I thought, oh, can I just give it another year? Can I just wait till Hannah's like 2 or 3 or something? You know what I mean? Just give myself a bit more time. But knowing that, you know, from a fertility perspective, like I was staring down the barrel of 40, like I may not, you know, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to give Hannah a brother or sister. And so we made the decision to have another child, and luckily my husband and I haven't had any, I mean, I had plenty of issues after we had the baby, but I haven't had any fertility issues per se. We haven't had any troubles falling pregnant, which has been a blessing. So and then luckily, well, maybe not luckily, having had my second born Henry now, it's just been such a wonderfully different experience. You know, he goes to, he's up sort of every 2 to 3 hours overnight, and I just go back to sleep. I'm not even wearing earplugs, and I just get back to sleep. And he's had the same sort of feeding issues that Hannah had, in that he's been quite unsettled. Sort of, this is a bit of too much information, but mucus poos, which is like a sign of cow's
intolerance. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not too much information. I'm sure many people listening to this going, oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so rather than like, and I just sort of said, okay, well, I'm not going to like have, I'm not going to cut out all these things from my diet again. Because I was still, again, not great breastfeeding. So I was like, okay, we're just going to swap to formula. And there was no, like, all of the sort of anxiety that surrounded the first time. It's just
yeah. And I think that's really hard for people to make that decision, especially when you're thinking of who you were that first time around, because that's very much how I was too, is researching everything and being in all of those breastfeeding groups and putting so much pressure on ourselves, which I think pressure can be healthy and unhealthy, right? Like the pressure to want to strive for a goal or to get all the information and be informed so you make an informed decision. That's like a good, healthy sense of pressure. But when you then realize that pressure is turning detrimental, when it's having an impact on your mental health and your well-being and your capacity in other areas of your life. And I also think a lot of people miss that side of the conversation when we're talking about things like sleep deprivation or feeding struggles, which are common things that a lot of people experience. And what works for one person may not work for another person, or works for one baby may not work for another baby. And you have to be able to make the decision and the choice that feels best for you and your child. And no one can tell you what to do. People love to tell you what to do, right? You'll get many of these opinions and unsolicited advice. But at the end of the day, it's so important to come back into your own person. And I also think, and also by the sounds of it, when it's your second, you can also see it so much more clearly in that way because you're reflecting on your previous experience. And it kind of helps that decision a bit more too, I think.
You kind of just zoom out, like, that analogy where they say it's not like you're not in the play, you're basically watching the play, or you've got a bird's eye view type thing. You can just zoom out and say, bigger picture.
Yeah.
They'll be fine. Like maybe they don't have the, all of the antibodies and things that you get with the breastfeeding and whatever. But you know what? They're also going to be more settled and happier and not have stomach pain or reflux or colic, and you're not going to be serving 3 meals for like one for your toddler, one for your husband, and one for you that's not got dairy or soy. Or, you know what I mean? Like it's just an easier. So having that perspective the second time round just made the decision. I mean, it still sucks, but it is what it is. I mean, there's plenty of other people that have plenty of other struggles in different areas, whether it be, their kid doesn't sleep, or their kid, has hip dysplasia and needs one of those braces, or they need they've got whatever insert issue type thing. Having that perspective has been really helpful. And it's just meant that even the couple of challenges that we've had with our newborn, his sister gave him a couple of respiratory viruses from daycare within 2 weeks of being born. And so, in his second week of life, we were in hospital because he needed some oxygen, because when they get infections that young, they don't really have a lot of like reserve. So,
so stressful.
And it was, but it was also, again, like it wasn't a good experience. It was terrible, but like it was good because it just allowed me to really step back and say, oh, you've actually come really far, Allison, because you can still sleep in hospital and you're not, spiraling. You're not sitting up in the middle of the night Googling RSV bronchiolitis, which is the particular thing that he had, and like what are the possible horrible long-term complications, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh gosh.
I know, but
Google can be the best and the worst.
It's right. My first obstetrician when I had Hannah, he joked to me because he knew that I was a real type A personality. He's like, oh, you probably would have been better off having a baby. He's like a dumb 16-year-old. And at the time, I didn't appreciate it. And his words have sort of come back in my head times since. And I've been like, yes, I would, because I would. Like there's definitely too much information for some, and
yeah. And when you're someone who's already prone to being quite anxious, it just goes 0 to 100 really fast. And I can relate to that because I did the same thing. And so then it's also the irony of like being up or not being able to go to sleep, and then you're still like feeding the anxiety because you're on your phone.
I was like, and I would have been like, when I had insomnia, I was, and because I had many hours in the night that you're not sleeping, I was Reddit forums about insomnia. where I was reading desperate people's stories about all of their terrible experiences and like just trying to search for like the magic book.
And I also don't think that's the worst thing though, because I also see how that's also you seeking not only information but seeking connection, like trying to go, hey, who else out there is existing like me? And so I don't think it's just me that has this problem, or I'm not alone.
Yeah, it's definitely that's true, but it also adds fuel to the fire.
I know it's both, isn't it? It's so hard.
Putting attention on things that you shouldn't put attention on. So yes, I agree with you. It does make sense. And that was why, and I think that's why when I sort of saw your Instagram post about, you know, like people having conversations with you about, you know, like our motherhood experiences. I had read a lot of those stories of mums with insomnia, really struggling with it. And so I thought, oh, this is kind of like, that's something that I experienced.
Did you really hate when you got that advice of sleep when the baby sleeps?
Yes.
Because you're like, well, I can't sleep.
No, correct. I hated that advice, and I hated the advice that everybody, there's like one of the things that they tell you, there's something called sleep hygiene techniques, which are things that often get wheeled out when people have insomnia. And it's things like, try to get morning sun and exercise for an hour a day and not
circadian rhythm kind of stuff. Yeah.
And there is a lot in that. And there's and basically trying not to be on screens and doing all this sort of stuff and cutting out caffeine. And if you sort of aren't having the quality sleep that you would like, then I would say maybe that might help you. But if you've got proper, full-blown, intractable insomnia, then none of those things touch the sides.
Yeah.
None of those things are going to, the only thing for me that I found that actually made a step function difference was dialing back my anxiety and accepting not sleeping, which is so counterintuitive. But like that.
It's not though. That really does make sense. It's like how you were talking about how we need to surrender as well in many aspects of motherhood. Yeah. Sometimes just having that acceptance alleviates enough pressure or enough anxiety or whatever the symptoms are that you're experiencing, that other things seem to click into place a little bit. And to me, the way you explain it makes sense. It's like anxiety or whatever is the root cause of the insomnia. Then of course you need to target what is under the surface. You can't just target things on surface level.
Yeah. And the other thing that really resonated with me was when I went to see a psychologist, the psychologist, because I've probably seen 2 or 3 now, and unfortunately I've just not managed to find one. I know how important they are, but I've just not managed to find one that really it's
hard to find one that you click with. It took me seeing like 5 people until I found the one that I stuck with for a long time.
And I was just like, and being a type A as well, I kind of went in and sat down and I was like, okay, I'm crazy, like fix me, give me the 10 steps and I'll do 10 steps and dot every I, like cross every T, and we'll just like think our way out of this, shall we?
Let's intellectualize our feelings. Yeah.
And so the first psychologist started with some cognitive behavioral therapy, which, and you'll be able to speak to this much more than me. I'm coming at it from definitely a lay person. But I was just, the idea of like rationalizing, or like I'd say whatever I thought, like my baby I'm worried that my baby has failure to thrive because they haven't met this growth target and they're going to end up needing a nasogastric tube and having terrible feeding issues forever. Or, and even saying it out loud, I realize how irrational it is based on the facts of the situation. But cognitive behavioral therapy for me, it would be, okay, well, these are the facts of the situation. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, challenging
it. Yeah. And I'd say, no, that doesn't make sense. And then I'd be left with that and being like, okay, it doesn't make sense, but I still think this. Like trying to use a broken brain to fix a broken brain. Like it doesn't, I really needed, what worked for me a lot more was getting into my body, because with my anxiety, I had really high blood pressure. I've never had high blood pressure in my life, but it was high for 3 or 4 months after I had Hannah, and my pulse was off the charts. Like I was really, and that sort of hypervigilance, that fight or flight, it just meant that I was, dumping all this cortisol into my system, and I was constantly in this like
dysregulated
state. And, like I'd talk to, constantly on the verge of tears, that sort of thing. So things that worked for me a lot better was things like journaling, meditation, getting like getting outdoors, like really trying to get into my body a bit more.
Yeah, bringing more body into that mind-body connection.
Yeah, exactly. And then that kind of, I found that. And then I did, so that was cognitive behavioral therapy, sort of the sort of trying to rationalize or sort of, you know, appreciate the irrationality of your thinking.
And CBT is probably one of the most popular therapeutic methods, but also one with a lot of people that not necessarily criticisms, but it's not the end all be all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
so
I think
it makes sense that for you're like, it wasn't enough, because that's quite common for
Yeah, and so the second thing I did was this acceptance commitment therapy, which is sort of just being okay with things as they are.
Yeah.
And being able to sit in the discomfort of a situation.
Yeah.
And
a lot of big change can happen from that.
Yeah, and like breathe your way through that, or just be in it. And so that sort of started to help a bit more, because that really then linked into sort of the meditation and the
instead of fighting it, allowing yourself to be with the emotion and let it course through. Yeah.
Right. So that really, really helped me. And then that sort of, if my anxiety was like a giant dial that was switched up to like extra high or like catastrophic level high, it sort of just started to dial it back. And the more I did those things, the more I meditated and the more I journaled and the more I was sort of like sat with that, and I was okay with, you know, I had a really good day on 3 hours sleep. My daughter smiled, or we went to some baby sensory class, or we did something, or I caught up with a friend for a coffee, or I just started to get all these sort of wins under my belt per se. And that then just gave me the confidence that like, okay, this may not be the situation that you want at the moment, but you can still have good times and things can still be, you can still manage with things exactly the way they are. And allowing that actually ironically helps them get better, because we just looked at it, just sort of you just stopped trying to be in control, you just let things be as they were. And that helped both from my anxiety perspective and then again with the insomnia as well. So and so that was for me a bit more of, and so that acceptance commitment therapy kind of resonated a bit more with me.
Yeah.
But I'm still, unfortunately, since I haven't got a psychologist at the moment because I don't have 10 minutes to myself, unfortunately. And I much prefer sitting in person rather than doing it over Zoom. But having said that, but that's sort of more of the modality that I think helps me.
Works for you best. Yeah, it's talking to someone. That makes sense, because I think there's this misconception that's kind of become a bit popular on social media lately, which is this idea of like the sole responsibility of healing or fixing your issues or whatever you want to call it being on you as an individual. And it's not true. Like, yes, accountability and personal responsibility is important, but really a lot of healing happens in relationship and in community. And someone, even like a psychologist, for example, is a relationship, because that therapeutic relationship can be so important and necessary for some people to just have that safe person you can go to feel comfortable, to be vulnerable, and then also having that person as a professional know how to hold space for you and help connect the pieces or provide tips or strategies, like whatever it is that you're needing. And that's a very different relationship to, say, like with your partner or with your friend, and their capacity to hold space for you as well. And also as a busy parent, having that dedicated like hour, knowing like, okay, this is my time where I'm going to get to talk about these things. That's really important too.
And it's so true. And it's such a, like, I would put that sort of in the self-care basket of things that go really, like, it's so difficult. And it's something that I still struggle with, is like finding time for self-care. It's so tricky.
It's hard,
and it's so important, especially when you have a history of like anxiety or depression or whatever, just to, because you might just be a person that just needs a bit more, you might need a few more tools in your toolkit. You might need a couple more hours a week. You might really need that sort of designated time where you can just have a cup of tea by yourself. And,
and when your children are under 3, I think that's the most crucial time for that, because there really is not much left in your tank to give to anyone else, let alone yourself, when they're that young. Usually when your youngest is 3, like from that stage on, you kind of feel like this different stage of your life kicks off. And that's definitely, I've noticed that in myself with my own experience, but also in talking with other people. I've started to notice how, and then the next shift seems to be more that school age.
Yeah.
You seem to then have like another chunk of time, or less worrying about them because you're not having to do all like the feeding and nappies and naps and whatever, all those things. Yeah. So it's just that also that acceptance, like you're talking about, with whatever season of parenthood that you're currently in with your children.
I know. It's so
trying to remind yourself it doesn't last forever, but it really feels like forever when you're in the thick of it with the under threes.
Oh, it's so tricky. And something I listened to recently that really resonated with me in terms of like the self-care piece is somebody, I'm trying to remember where I heard it, but it was basically saying that I'm trying to remember it properly now, how important it is like for you and your partner not only to give each other time for self-care, and that doesn't have to be an equal amount of time. It doesn't have to be like you got 2 hours last.
No tip for tap behavior.
3 hours this week or whatever it is, and appreciating that everybody has different self-care needs.
Definitely.
The other thing is for me, being a person that like, if something's not right, say, your kid's not sleeping or something's happening, I'll just try harder. I'll just do more. I'll just like, if I just increase the amount of effort, then maybe it'll be okay. And I'm really resistant to self-care, like really, really resistant. And somebody, I think this podcast, they were talking about like what you had mirrored to you growing up is how you are. And so somebody said to me, they were like, oh, how much self-care did your mum have when you were growing up? And I was like, none. None. She never caught up with friends for a coffee. She never had an interest. She never like played sport. She never did anything. Ever in our entire history of my childhood did I ever see her do anything for herself other than maybe going and getting her hair done like once every couple of months type thing. And they said, well, what sort of example is that setting for your child? You know what I mean? Like, and that sort of accountability that I needed to be like, oh shit, right.
Yeah. Okay. That role modeling part is so important, not only when we reflect on who we are and we think about our parents or our caregivers, but also then going, oh, I'm now the parent and what do I want to be role modeling to my children?
It's so funny because I know how important self-care is, but for whatever reason, doing it for myself isn't enough. But then when I realize, when someone says to me, well, you know what, you're role modeling for your child, then I think, oh, well, if I'm role modeling this for my child, I don't want them to grow up thinking that they can't have self-care. So that gives me permission to then.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And I've talked to people about this before in sessions, and it's like, I like to talk about how motherhood, even though it can like tear you apart in all the ways that we know, it can also be a great opportunity for healing because it kind of pushes you forward a bit. And sort of like what you're mentioning is, even though we wouldn't have done things like, take the self-care example that we're talking about, and then all of a sudden you think of it in a different way to your children and how you want to show up, using them kind of as your reason to be pushed through into that. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It can be if that's like only ever your reason, or it's part one, isn't it, to try to like fully understand the nuance of all of that.
I think you should be able to give yourself permission. Like there's a whole stuff to unpack in that.
There's a lot to unpack.
You should be able to give yourself permission to just do it for yourself.
And so let's end on that, is if you notice that resistance, that you cannot give yourself permission, then that is definitely something to take to a mental health professional and get some help unpacking that.
I know. Oh my goodness. It's so crazy, isn't it? All these things. It's definitely been a good journey. I mean, being a mother's amazing. So I should feel like I've spent an hour talking about all of the difficulties that I've had since having.
You don't have to censor yourself. And also, I think it's really important for us to be honest about our experiences. But what you're talking about with like the insomnia, right? It's not like your child's caused that. So we're not bashing on our kids. Everyone knows how much you love your children. It's funny how when we talk any remote of negativity, we feel like we have to censor ourselves and be like, I swear I love my children.
I know. And my husband said to me, he was like, he did that thing where he was like, oh, you don't want to wish these years away, you really gotta these moments, they pass so quickly, you'll look back on this and realize it. And I was like, after a night of like whatever sleep deprivation, I'm like, right now, really?
Yeah. It's not helpful at all right now.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes me want to sign divorce papers right now. Oh, Allison, it's been so lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable and brave and coming on and sharing with us your story.
No worries. Thank you for having me. I really appreciated it.